Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and Assalamu alaikum, Your Excellencies, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you after 2 years of COVID, and what we've heard today makes me really, really energized. Good to see so many old friends and colleagues. My name is Munir Ferozi. I am IFC's regional head for PPP Transaction Advisory, covering privatization. So I have the easy job of moderating this distinguished panel. I'm going to be asking them difficult questions. We have assembled a fantastic panel over here, starting from the minister, an investor, an operator, a lawyer, and an industry expert. So welcome all.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree that COVID has been a black swan event for the whole world, but I think the aviation industry has been unfairly and most impacted industry because of the COVID. If you look at the last 4 crises, whether it's the Gulf crisis, the Asian crisis, the 9/11, or the 2008 financial crisis, the impact of COVID has been much higher. Let me put some numbers for perspective. 2022, the first year where we've seen a little bit of uptick of the traffic compared to 2009, still has a 26% decline in the traffic. The overall reduction in seats is about 20 to 25%, so from 4 billion to about 3 billion. The overall reduction of passengers is about 1 billion, and then the impact of debt on the industry is about 180 to 200 billion. That's huge numbers. However, on the positive side, the demand of air traveling is returning, but it's returning in different ways. So for instance, the business travel is changing. I think people are taking longer to go do business travel. They're not traveling as frequently. And also there is a sustainability issue in terms of personal travel, whereby people don't want to basically travel as much because it has the impact on GHG emissions. The remote work and other flexible working arrangements, we expect them to continue. So what does it mean for our industry? To us, we see 4 repercussions. And those repercussions are going to inform how the future will look like. The first one, we've seen a number of bailouts in the industry. We've seen the government sector playing a large role in terms of keeping the industry afloat. I mentioned 180 billion of debt has been taken for that. We've seen an underperformer perform better now. So cargo was an underperformer, is performing better during the pandemic. We've also seen a shift of wide-body to narrow-body aircrafts that has a repercussion in terms of operations, safety, efficiencies, but also has higher costs for repairs. And we've also seen, a pivoting in terms of network experimentation. So 1,400 new routes have been added, 500 in Asia, 600 in Europe, over 200 in China. Now, putting all this into context, where we see the air travel coming back, the demand recovering slowly and gradually, and by 2024, IATA expects the demand to be at pre-COVID 2019 levels. We also saw, as I mentioned, a lot of bailouts and $180 billion of debt. So how do we match these two, right? Whereas the demand of the traffic is increasing, the infrastructure needs to be expanded, the government's debt levels have increased, and people will start traveling again. What we have seen is concessions have proven to be much more permanent in terms of taking the pressure off the governments. And if they're structured properly, the private sector can bring a lot more efficiencies, a lot more value for money, but we need to have a partnership approach. And this is really where I want to have a discussion with our panel in terms of what happened in the last 2 years, did the concessions survive, and what does it mean in terms of the future, in terms of these concessions being structured. Let me turn to our distinguished panel to have a conversation, and I would like to start with you, Dr. Ibrahim. First of all, welcome. Good to see you. Dr. Ibrahim, you are a key private sector player in this kingdom. You invested in Medina back in 2011 and 12 when PPPs were not even in fashion, right? You took that punt. And then obviously pandemic struck in 2019 and the concession was suffering. So tell us a little bit about what is actually needed in terms of running a concession, and particularly in a black swan event such as a pandemic. What should one do, both from a private sector perspective, so your perspective, and your advice in terms of what should be done from a public sector perspective? And really talk a little bit about our concessions agreements enough to hold during a pandemic, or do you need to have a different approach? So over to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Munir. Maybe it's important before I start, just maybe to give a very quick brief about the Medina airport in specific, which is maybe an example of some of the Saudi airports. We started our concession back in, or we took over back in June 2012. And since that time, from 2012 until 2019, the traffic at Medina Airport is almost doubled, from 4 million passengers up to around 8 million passengers, which is a very high growth in almost 6-7 years. And that maybe goes with what His Excellency Minister of Transport, as well as His Excellency GACA President said earlier today. The growth in the Saudi market is high, and the potential is very, very high. However, when Corona started early first quarter 2020, and the effect start from March 2020, we saw two, I would say, exceptional years, which is 2020 as well as 2021, where we saw the traffic in Medina dropped from 8 million to around 2 million as an average, which is 25%. And for a concession where you have a huge commitment to your lender, your operation, where you have to have the operation fully ready despite the number of passengers in the airport, you have to do many actions. And these actions cannot be done alone unless otherwise other stakeholders get involved in this. So we start communicating with GACA at that time, and we had an interesting open discussion with them until October 2022, when we signed the high-level MOU, which tried to formalize how we will take it forward, before even GACA at that time start appointing their advisors to redraft the concession. At that time, took from us almost a year, as BTO agreement, as we all know, does not reflect how you will handle or deal with such issues. It's just formalized rather than exactly tell you what you should do. And this is what exactly happened at that time, where is it a political event or a force majeure or whatever, and everyone have his own views, and we as a developer, we see it in one angle, and the client see it in another angle, maybe other stakeholders also see it in a different angle, until we reach to, I would say, a common ground is we need all to work to save this concession for the best interest of our industry. And we worked openly, in open book, in open numbers, and GACA saw all our numbers. Their advisors work and saw our numbers. IFC saw our numbers. The lawyers and the financial advisors saw it, until we reached to an understanding by end of 2021, where we agreed in a formula which I assume never been maybe implemented or tested somewhere else, where now we have an understanding and a clear understanding from that time until when this concession will be either extended or renewed for another time. That is, so the most important thing I would say, the concession or the agreement does not tell you in such cases what you should do, rather than give you the general direction. And with the stakeholders, you need to work closely to reach an agreement, I would say a win-win agreement for all related party in this agreement.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. That was very helpful. I will come back to this intervention if we have some time. I think what you're saying really is the concession agreement provides the building blocks, but we need to be flexible and you need to be adapt in terms of how the situation evolves. I would like to turn to Your Excellency, Senator Hadi. A very warm welcome, first of all, to the Kingdom, as well as to the Aviation Forum.
Thank you.
We understand that Nigeria is looking to concession 4 airports. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about why you're looking to choose the private sector. What is your plan in terms of concessioning those airports? And if I understand correctly, you are looking to do non-aeronautical services. Is there a particular reason behind that?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very glad to be here and to share our thoughts. So we in Nigeria decide to go for the concession of our airports because we believe, especially in the government led by President Muhammad Buhari, that government has no business in business. For efficiency, for greater capital, for better value and better service, we think that to concession these airports into the private sector would get all of these to work together, and then the customer benefits more. And also, because it's a concession and the risk is shared, we also get more as a government, as owners of those assets. However, in the past, during the government that precedes us, they thought of privatization to cede the entire asset to private sector. And we started the privatization. It went, may I say, well at the beginning. We sold the handling companies, Sarkol and NACO. It went very well in privatization. Then we came to the airline, and then it didn't settle well. Eventually, the airline had to be liquidated, and we lost it. So when we came in as a government, we said, oh, wait a minute. We are practicing social democracy as a philosophy of our party, the APC under Buhari. So we decided to concession, hold the asset, remains with the people, but take it and give it to private sector, 20 years, 25 years or more, in which, within the period which they would develop it and make it better. Now, the question here is, what is our plan for the future? The future is that we are going to privatize all of our airports gradually, and because it is a new thing, concession is new in Nigeria, it came with a lot of resistance, especially from the unions, the labor unions, which don't really understand this concession. So we took time to plan carefully, to engage with them, to explain to them why. Why non-aeronautical? Non-aeronautical because of the level of our development at this moment. We're thinking that is the next phase of concession. We get done with the terminal buildings and the airports, and then we come later perhaps to do the ANS, to do the runways and so on and so forth. But there's also another concern as a government that we have in Nigeria. Sometimes ceding some of these critical assets that are seen as critical national security assets may perhaps not be very wise at the level of our development. It could happen in Europe, it could happen in America because of the level of their development. As it will take time, it will be gradual, it's something that will come in the future. So gradually we will privatize all these airports by way of concession, not total outright sell. This is one. And I think also tied with this, we need to explain that we've gone very far in this concession. We've issued a request for qualifications. They came back to us. We selected people that we think have qualified. We've given them the NDAs to sign. They all signed and returned back, and we'll now issue them with a request for proposals. And we wish that before the end of the year, we would concession these first 4 airports, and we'll continue. Some of these airports, yes, we put in money there in Nigeria to upgrade them, but there's a lot to be done. Example, Lagos. The first Lagos airport was built for 200,000 passengers per annum in 1979. Today, Lagos alone is doing about 12 million. And nothing was added to that structure. So it's chaos, it's too small, it's inefficient, and facilitation is very difficult and tedious. But today, we put in a 14 million new terminal building. Together with the old, the concessionaire will take the old, revive it, put together, and run the airport more efficiently. And this is the plan by Nigeria. And I think going this way, I think we're doing the right thing because our roadmap being implemented in aviation, centered around public-private partnerships, has seen the doubling of airports in Nigeria. Now we have about 40 airports in Nigeria. It doubles the number of airlines. It quadruples the number of passengers. We took passenger number from mere 8 million to about 18 million and now growing before COVID. And aviation becomes the fastest growing sector of the Nigerian economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And in the interest of time, I'd like to move to Dr. Fedi. He's the aviation expert and has worked around the globe. And I'd like you to cover, and just in the interest of time, if you could do it in 3 to 4 minutes maximum, and this is a request to the rest of the panelists as well, and I want to give everyone a chance as well. What are the different forms of support that the governments have provided across the world? Some of the good examples and the bad examples in terms of dealing with this pandemic, the extraordinary situation of the pandemic.
The government support, maybe the word support is not exactly accurate in terms of the wording, but we witnessed it at the beginning. The government was just doing nothing, saying this is a concession, live with it. And then basically many concessionaires went back to their lenders, trying to find a way to balance at least the agreement. And then the lenders came back and said, look, go back to your client, make sure that you have the same understanding, and then maybe Medina example, just make sure that you can have at least same definition of force majeure or it's a political event or whatever you name it. So that was the first reaction, and actually in all jurisdictions I went through. And then at some point, the first move came from where the both parties, the guarantor and the concessionaire, having the same understanding by which saying that the concessions or privatization process is the most efficient way to enhance passenger experience, to reach a optimum level of CapEx, and basically to increase the traffic and the revenue for both parties. When both parties having the same understanding, they move very fast. The example is Brazil, where they came back to all concessions, and the right thing I think they've done there is like they put lenders, concessionaires, themselves, the government. Brazil a little bit different because they have Infraero, like GACA here in KSA, and they have the SEC, which is the Minister of Transport, but both important parties. And then they sit down in the same room and then they discuss. And they came up with different options. Sometimes they extend the term of the concessions. Sometimes they waive for some period of time the collection of revenues. And sometimes, in some example for a small airport, which is very interesting, is they try to allocate traffic in the way where they balance basically the country. Brazil can do that, it's a big country. KSA, I think they can do that as well, if the case will happen. But in some countries, it's a little bit challenging. Jordan, very close from here, still discussions. So it's a kind of a process where both parties, they have to digest the case of COVID, first time happening, so it's normal. But they have to move very fast. So basically, to your question, to the point, sometimes they waive the collection, sometimes they allocate some traffic, sometimes they extend the terms. Medina is one of the examples. Mostly they extend the terms. This is what we saw like almost in 3 out of 4 cases. But there are some governments are a little bit more innovative as well, combination of both, and where, again, they understand that the lenders have some leverage on this. Sometimes the government, they don't understand there is the concessionaire, they have a pressure from the lenders, which is, I think, very important, crucial points that many government, they have to understand on that. So that's really kind of quickly, 3-4 minutes.
Thank you. I know I'm not doing justice to your experience,
Very
but what to
complex
do.
situation.
What
Go
to
ahead,
do.
yeah.
We are always under pressure in these events. So let me just maybe turn to Mr. Fahad. You are the CEO of Dammam Airports, the first corporatized entity back in 2017, 5-year track record now. Tell us a little bit about what are the challenges of being a government-owned private corporatized company operating a large airport, maybe 3 airports for you, 10 million passengers going to 16, right? What were some of the challenges as you took over this airport, and what are some of the lessons learned that you'd like to share with the audience?
Okay. Thank you very much. Dammam Airport Company is actually operating 3 airports in the eastern region right now. King Fahd International Airport, Al-Hasa or Al-Hafuf, and Al-Gaisuma Airport. Now, you're right, back to 2017, Dammam Airport Company established to operate King Fahd International Airport. The main reason maybe it's pop up when we mention the word privatization, that people believe that it's only focused on revenue raising. And it's actually more than a revenue raising, or at least it's not a direct revenue raising activity. It's, I like when His Excellency mentioned connect. So I think the main reason behind efficiency or operating in the right model or generating more revenue, raising satisfaction of the customer is to connect, is actually to be closer to the passenger, which is, I used to call them passenger before I joined. Now I call them customers because I have an external and internal customers. So one of the most important things, you need to know exactly where are you going. You need to make sure that if your internal customer is not happy, your external customer will never get happy. And your internal customer could be a service provider in the airport, government entity, or employees. Now, one great belief, I think it's burned deep inside all Saudis after that great vision of Saudi Arabia, Vision 2030, sky is not a limit. So it's never enough to develop. So what you did today, or what you did great today, it's not great tomorrow. So you need to continue developing to the service that you provide. One main challenge, which is mind, we will talk about the shift of the mind, moving from providing a service to providing the service. Feeling that this is a service, free, it's provided, you need to accept the minimum because it's free. And now we're thinking that whatever we're going to do is not enough to fulfill the customer itself. So I think I will try to use the example of the aviation sector. Turbulence is always there, and turbulence never stop a plane to reach a destination. It could delay it, but never stop it. And destination is not the journey. The journey is the whole exercise, including the turbulence. So developing people, being close to your customers, internal and external, believe from inside that it's never enough. You need to develop. And also, you need to believe that you have a different nature than any other airports. You're serving in different country, different city. The things that could apply in King Fahd International Airport could not apply in King Khalid International Airport or King Abdulaziz. We're in total different, let's say, nature. So keep developing, accept, criticize, turbulence as a part of the journey, being close to your customer, and that's the whole thing.
Thank you, Mr. Fahad. That was really interesting. And then last but not the least, my good old friend Antoine. He's a lawyer by training. He's a partner at White & Case, and I call his business the recession-proof business. Because pandemic or not pandemic, lawyers are always busy. So, and Antoine, you've been involved in a number of rebalancing, particularly the one over here. What advice would you give? I mean, of course, hoping that this pandemic is over, but there could be another event in the future. What advice would you give both to the government and private operators in terms of navigating the planes of the concession agreement, in terms of ensuring the flexibility in the concession agreement itself, but also dealing with it when the challenge arises?
Well, thank you, Munir. The first thing, of course, is if you have a good contract, we'll be very specific about how to deal with those risks, whether it's an epidemic or a pandemic, which are two different things. Which risks constitute force majeure events, natural force majeure, political force majeure, change in law, political events, etc. A well-structured contract will be very specific about that, which is why you need to have good lawyers, as a side note. But what those contracts don't do and cannot do is provide for a long-term fix to a long-term issue. What those contracts do, and they do relatively well, is provide for a relatively short-term fix to those issues. For example, if you have a force majeure event that goes on for 6 months, you'll have a 6 months relief, you'll have compensation payable to the concessionaire in some cases, or no compensation payable to the concessionaire, in which case the risk is borne by the concessionaire and therefore by extension to the lenders, and sometimes by the insurance providers over that 6 months period. But if you have a so-called black swan event, as you said, that goes on for 2 years, ultimately, and no one is essentially taking that risk, in other words, the grantor or the government is not compensating the concessionaire or the lenders, and it's not an insurable event, the project company will go insolvent. And of course, the contract will contemplate that if the project company goes insolvent, well, you have a termination regime that is, provided under the contract. But that doesn't really help. That tells you how to terminate the deal. That tells you exactly who gets paid in case of termination, what the lenders get, what the shareholders get, which is normally nothing, etc. But it's of course not in anyone's interest to terminate the project, and we're talking about an airport and therefore a strategic asset. So if you really want to restructure the deal, you're in kind of uncharted territory, and as others have said very well, it's a negotiated process. It's a bilateral negotiated process. And there's no real roadmap to do that. Now, the best way to do it, I think, as a number of us have been involved in those restructuring processes, is to be very transparent. I think it's easier said than done, but it's very important because you have the grantor, the regulator, the government, for example, the Ministry of Finance. You have, again, the regulator, you have the lenders, multiple lenders, various shareholders. You have so many parties with different interests. But ultimately, the only thing that really matters is making sure that the project goes back on track. And if the parties are not willing to share, for example, their traffic forecast, the financial model, the bank commitments, and virtually all of their commercial concerns, then it's going to be very difficult to restructure the deal. So I think the first takeaway is that it only works if it's done on a fully transparent basis. And then in terms of, very quickly, in terms of what can be done, I think you've touched upon that already in terms of potential creative ways to restructure. One way to do it is, of course, to provide some kind of temporary relief to the concessionaire by way of waiving the concession charge or the concession share, depending on how it's called, extending the term of the concession, etc. Sometimes the shareholders have to contribute additional equity to the project, so that affects their IRR. So the economics of the project get changed for a period of time. But the flip side of that, I think it's also important from a government perspective, from a grantor's perspective, is that if you do provide relief, there has to be a flip side to that. And the flip side, so that the deal works for both sides. And the flip side is that if and when the traffic goes back to normal, the government or the grantor gets something out of it. And whether that's an additional share of the revenues or some kind of profit-sharing mechanism, a number of options can be contemplated, but basically, and that's, I guess, the second and final takeaway, is that if you share the pain, also share the gain.
Thank you very much, Antoine. I know I have not been able to do that justice with the experience in this room. we've been asked to land and go to immigration, but before we do that, I want to maybe just do a few conclusions, if I may. First of all, I think what we have noticed, COVID has impacted our industry, but demand is coming back. What has that taught us in terms of, particularly in this country, which I think has been a pioneer in the PPPs in the aviation sector, both in terms of starting out back in 2011-12, having a very successful concession, and then also rebalancing it. I think what for me, because I was involved in it personally as well, the partnership approach and the flexibility is important for both the public and the private sectors. And I think the transparency that Antoine talked about is extremely important. You need to share the pain and you need to share the gain as well. Nobody has the crystal ball, right? As long as it's a fair deal, one needs to basically see, how do we survive the concession? Termination is not good for anyone, neither for the concession, not for the grantor, nor for the private sector. So as much as is possible, one should try to make sure that you salvage the concession, because that will set back not only the PPP program, it has an impact on the private sector, but also the services that we talked about. I think what is also clear is with the rising debt levels, there should be a lot more PPPs and privatization. They have withstood the test of time, particularly when they're well structured. So this is something that we really look forward to. Good to hear from His Excellency that Nigeria is looking at it. Would really love to work with you. You want to come in?
Yes, please. Just to say that because of the experience that we had in Nigeria at the time, Nigeria Airways failed privatization, and then also the outright sale of Abuja Airport at some time failed. At that time, there was no institutional framework in place in Nigeria. So Nigeria established an agency called Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission. And since then, a lot of transactions had happened, and none of them went bad. And in Nigeria, you cannot cancel concession once it is signed. And also, the owners of the assets will sign service level agreements to ensure that every other thing is working well so they can get more value for money. That's what I want to add.
Okay, thank you. And then the last point I wanted to make is COVID or any event like this is not an opportunity to rebalance your bad investment decisions. It's an opportunity to look at a black swan event or a force majeure and give you relief for a short period of time. So I think this is really where an openness and the candor and transparency of the deal makes a lot of sense. So without further ado, I know that we are late, so I want to thank my panelists for an engaging discussion. Please join me in thanking them.
Well, a huge thank you and a round of applause for a fantastic panel, ably chaired by Captain Munir. Thank you very much indeed. That was first class. Once again, thank you.